In 1816, John Rexroad built a gristmill on his property that would become an economic as well as a social center in the Bluegrass Valley. 200 years later, Judd and Dabney Bankert are working to save that mill as a place for their retirement and a place where local citizens can proudly point out their heritage.
People fondly remembered going to the mill when it was operating. They passed these stories down to their children who recognized the mill as a significant place in their parents' lives or their grandparents' lives. It's such an attractive building, standing out in the open the way it does, that it became something of a historic landmark just to the community because of its past history and because of its look.
If John Rexroad's mill was only a place where grain was ground into flour, it would be enough of a reason to save the mill. But this mill is so much more than that.
The mill became quite a social gathering place. People would come with their horses and teams and sit and chat while they waited their turn to get their flour ground. So you can just imagine that mill rumbling to life, and noise and dust and people chattering. The mill was a very active spot.
The New Hampden Mill is one of the few surviving mills in the county, and the only one that still boasts its original outward appearance. The original mill was powered by water. And oh, what water it was. Just next to the mill is the south branch of the Potomac River, just 5 miles from where the famous river begins. It was on a trip to visit friends in the area that Judd and Dabney Bankert first saw the mill.
We came just thinking that we were going to come for a weekend. Dab and I, when we looked at it, were completely charmed. I mean, it just harkened back to an age long lost out here in the county. The fact that we restored historic properties before and had always been interested in them in that regard, in my work with the tax credits, I mean, just old structures like this just fascinate both of us.
The hurdles were formidable, but Judd was no novice to this work. He had been a CPA whose practice had been built around helping people benefit from the Virginia Historic Tax Program. And he knew from experience that this project would only be economically feasible if credits from that program could be obtained. As a licensed Class B contractor, he also knew that the mill's foundation had deteriorated so severely that if something was not done soon, the mill would not be standing much longer. Judd would spend 6 months working with project architect Mark Paxton, developing a plan for the rehabilitation of the mill. Judd and Mark would travel to Richmond to meet with the staff of DHR, and afterwards Mark continued to consult with the staff of DHR as the plan was formulated.
The key piece for me is the timber frame, the heavy timber frame. The hand-hewn beams, fairly irregular in shape, but still you can see the hand-hewing of the rustic timbers, and and that's the coarsest structural expression. That's the biggest impressive artifact. And part of that, and working with that, is the mechanisms of the mill. The thing that sort of recalls in anybody's mind sitting in the mill with a job to do or a drink in their hand is what went on here. The memory, the historical memory of the place is in the machinery. So you have the timber frame, the enclosure, and then you have all the chutes and belts and gears and drive shafts of the mill. Those two things, if you count them as one, would be the singular thing that impressed me about the mill. And it was a building well into the process of destruction, by neglect. Demolition by neglect is the famous preservation phrase. So we were kind of getting it in there in the immediately pre-hospice part of the life of the mill.
Mark Paxton was experienced in saving historic properties, but he was only one of the experts Judd hired to help plan the work so that it would comply with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. In January of 2014, the initial Part 2 of the application for Virginia Historic Tax Credits was submitted to DHR for its review. It is in the Part 2 that the plans for rehabilitation are described in detail. It would take several months and the submission of 2 clarifying amendments. But on August 26, 2014, DHR issued a determination letter approving the Part 2 rehabilitation plan. Or so it seemed. The project, as described in the original Part 2 application, as revised by the following amendments, is approved as submitted. With the approval letter in hand and winter fast approaching, Bankert quickly moved forward with insulating and paneling the mill. Just about the time that work was completed, another letter arrived, a letter that baffled him and everyone else associated with the project. Upon review of the materials, DHR tax credit staff formed the unanimous opinion that the concealment of the exposed wall construction continues to detract significantly from the historic character of the original mill building. Was the staff of DHR telling him that in order for the mill project to qualify for historic tax credits, it would have to remain uninsulated and the interior walls left bare? How could anyone live there? From the beginning, this had always been presented to DHR as an adaptive reuse project. Could the staff at DHR actually think you could live in the mill as it was?
It's leaky, it's drafty, there's no heat, it's uninsulated, it's open, it's fully vented. It's open the way a colander is open. There's a membrane, but it's got cracks and gaps.
During the preceding 9 months, and based on verbal assurance from DHR that the stabilization work was acceptable, Judd and Dabney had already invested over $200,000 in stabilizing the mill, only to now be told that to get historic tax credits, the mill would have to remain uninsulated. Without insulation and paneling, how could you make the mill livable? DHR seemed to be rejecting the whole idea of adaptive reuse, the cornerstone of the tax credit program. The Bankerts were desperate to try to find a way to address DHR's concerns while still moving forward. As chance would have it, the last project Judd had worked on before retirement as a CPA had been an adaptive reuse of a barn. Judd decided to consult with the architect he had worked with on that project, John Rett. John reviewed the Part 2 application and visited the mill to see firsthand what impact the installation of paneling had on the historic character of the mill. His findings were the exact opposite of the staff of DHR. John felt that the paneling did not detract from the historic architectural character of the mill and found other examples of vertical paneling in the mill that had been overlooked. On Judd and Dabney's behalf, John contacted the staff person DHR assigned as the reviewer for the project in hopes of finding a solution that would be acceptable to all concerned. John was told that the Bankerts' only option at this point was to make an appeal to the director of DHR, Julie Langan, who is the only person with the authority to reverse a denial of historic tax credits.
There's been a lot of sleepless nights, I'll tell you. And not the least of one was, quite honestly, the shock of realizing that we may not have the financial support we expected from tax credits. And to find that out after, initially being told in August that you're going to get them and proceeding, and then all of a sudden a month later finding out you're not. And, that was September of last year. And, all of a sudden realizing that a significant piece of funding might not be there, that was a tough couple of weeks kind of getting your head around that and deciding what will you do. And we decided to proceed in the hopes that we knew what we were doing was right, and we knew from my experience and for almost 15 years working with these projects and the two architects that looked at it and the millwrights, we just realized that we hoped anyway, it was just a communication problem with DHR, so we decided to continue on. But that was a painful experience. It was not something I would wish anybody to have to go through, quite honestly.
From the beginning, the challenge had been to find a way to insulate the mill in such a way as to protect the historic materials and character and meet modern building code requirements for a residence. The mill had to be insulated if it was going to be used as a residence.
Point of contention appears to be, for the Department of Historic Resources, this paneling. The paneling was made with Virginia pine, variable width and variable length, which we thought would have been very much like what would have conceivably, if they had paneled the miller's office or somewhere else in the mill.
In the mill state, you have a building that has horizontal siding and you have a secondary structural expression inside. You have the heavy timbers that I talked about that were identified as key elements in the visual field inside. And then you have all the sort of secondary framing, the wall studs, the bracing, the back side of the exterior siding as seen from inside. And then you have areas of the mill that had other purposes. In this particular case, this mill, and the way it was used and operated, it was minimal, but there was still areas where they had interior wood boards used as planking or paneling to close off and separate space. And that became sort of the generator of the idea that we had in trying to figure out what to do with the wall assembly to make it a higher performing energy system, how we might enclose that system, what was, the design model going to be for what that would become. In addition to that, we did research into other mills that were slightly different maybe in their operations or in their approach to milling or construction type. And we found a lot of examples of mills with vertical boards used inside as a sort of a wall fill material or paneling. So we had the on-site example of vertical boards used to enclose areas, mostly around the stairs and things like that, and ancillary walls and structures, not too many enclosures inside the mill. And then we had historical examples from other mills that we looked at in research. And we developed the philosophy and decided that what we would do is develop an insulated wall system that had a weathering barrier to shed moisture to the outside, protect the insulation from becoming damp. And on the inside, we would simply, over supplemental furring that we applied, we would mount this board planking finish in keeping with some examples that were already in the mill and also other examples that we found in pictorial research.
Lorraine White of the Highland County Historical Society was also surprised.
I found that quite unbelievable because he's doing everything he can to preserve the outside of the mill in its original state. In the interior, anything that he has done is reversible. Nothing that he's installed couldn't be removed without damaging the structure. And I think that's key to the preservation effort.
The letter noted two specific points of the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation that it felt were not met by this application. The historic character of the property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided.
But in this particular case, no historic material was removed. I mean, it was there, and it remains there. And the way that we approached the furring and the insulating and the sheathing of the interior of the building for the new residential use was such that separations were maintained to the historic, what I'll call the historic fabric. The historic bones of the building are all still there.
When making its decision to withdraw approval of tax credits, the staff of DHR felt that by covering the interior walls of the mill, that the distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property would be lost.
In the public domain, where it's important in the community from the exterior to the passerby, all of that is intact and as it was, but in the private interior domain of the residents, the view of that, of the back sides of that, the utility side of that, of those materials is changed, is altered. Like I said earlier, in a way that we felt was compatible with methods used in mills and yet suitable for adaptation to the residential purpose. So I don't really see the conflict with that, with number 2 or number 5 in the preservation guidelines.
And what might the impact of this decision be on other restoration efforts in the county?
Well, I could see that Other people interested in restoring historic structures would hesitate to undertake a project because of the known costs. It's more expensive to rehabilitate some of these structures than it is to build new. And if credits were not available, some significant structures might not be saved.
It's not like there's another Joe coming along to do the same job, and maybe they have a better way. You know, it's in a lot of these rural situations, it's the time is now, and you're the guy or the gal, and that's what's going to make that project happen for its eternity or never.
The Bankerts have submitted their appeal to the Director of Historic Resources, Julie Langen, asking her to use the power granted to her to reverse the denial of Virginia historic tax credits for the New Hampden Mill and approve the Part 2 as amended. They are now awaiting the Director's decision.